All right, so in this tidbit, I'm going to talk about a question that always comes up. Everyone asks themselves this question throughout the course of really the first 2 years of medical school, and it's should I go to class? And like all complicated questions like this one, the answer is it depends. It depends. And I wish I had a cleaner answer to give you, but it really depends if you think about it on three factors. Is it a requirement for you to go to class? Does your university have a attendance policy? And if there is an attendance policy, you can close this video right now because you can't get beyond a requirement. If there is a requirement, you have to show up to class. But let's just say, you don't have a requirement at all, or there's some sort of limited requirement. The next thing you kind of want to consider when deciding if you want to go to class or not is, are podcasts available for those lectures? And podcasts are important because it allows you to listen to and oftentimes see what the professor is saying during the course of the lecture. So it adds a level of detail beyond the slides. And my rule of thumb is this: whether or not I go to class, I always listen to the professor. So whether I go to class and add to my study guide that I talked about in my other video about how to study, I've listened to the professor and I've made notes on what the professor says, or I listen to the podcast, my rule of thumb is I always have to go through the lecture, whether it's at the same time when the professor's there in front of my face, or if I'm at home in my PJs watching the podcast. So this is a requirement regardless. So it's important to know if you have a podcast system or not, because if you don't, then you're kind of bound to going to class to get what the professor is saying. And then the third thing to really kind of consider here is, and this is very specific to me and my study strategy that I talked about in my tidbit about how to study in medical school, but it is, did you pre-read the information? And this is extremely important because if I, in the beginning of the school year when I started, I didn't pre-read information. I would just go to class and I'd download the slides right before class, and I'd look at them and the professor, I'd look at them as the professor was teaching. And oftentimes it's really a deer in a headlights situation where I kind of don't even understand what's going on in the diagram on the slide, or I'm freaking out because of the large amount of information that is on the slide. So it is extremely important to decide, if you have pre-read, I think it's a good idea to go to class, because then you don't have to spend time later on and add to your study guide. You can just knock it out in the 50 minutes that the professor is lecturing. So I think there's a benefit to that if you have pre-read it. If you haven't, then I personally don't think it's valuable to go, because, like I said, most of the times you're just going to be confused and not fully understanding the information. And like I said, this is my perspective. I have classmates who look at the slides, for the first time when they go to class, and they're doing very well. And that this is just my perspective, and you can definitely get more opinions as well. But this is the way that I view it. I think pre-reading is the most valuable tool to a medical student. So, in my opinion, if you have a podcast system, if you have podcasts and you didn't pre-read the information, I would say don't go. If you have pre-read the information, regardless of if there are podcasts or not, I recommend going to class. I think that there's a huge benefit to going to class if you've pre-read, because then whatever the professor is saying is really reinforcing what you pre-read that morning. So I think that's beneficial. It's also beneficial, kind of like on the side, to think about if there are diagrams. If there are diagrams that are on the slides when you're pre-reading them, or when you're kind of just glancing at the slides, I have found that if I'm sitting there when the professor is explaining those diagrams, I do a better job, because oftentimes with podcasts, you can't see the professor pointing to certain parts of the diagrams, and it's extremely complicated, as many of you may know, when you start going over all the nuclei in neuroscience. If you don't understand where they are, it just doesn't make sense. So for those kinds of lectures, I think it's valuable to go to class regardless of if you've pre-read or not. So I hope that this kind of clarifies my thinking. I usually am a class goer if I've pre-read the information. That is almost always my rule of thumb, and it has served me fairly well.